All right, here we are. The lesson series is entitled Joshua and Judges for Beginners, From Conquest to Settled Land. This is lesson number 3 in the series, and the title of this lesson is Conquest of Jericho and I. And we'll be covering Joshua chapter 5, verse 1 to chapter 8, verse 35. So if we get into our story, as the Israelites prepare to conquer Jericho, we talked about that last time, several crucial spiritual steps were taken to ensure that they were in alignment with God's will and they were ready for the task at hand. These steps were foundational for their spiritual readiness and as well their covenantal faithfulness. Remember, the idea of covenant here is very important. First of all, some of the things that they did to prepare spiritually was circumcision of the new generation. After crossing the Jordan River, God commands Joshua to circumcise the new generation of Israelites born during their wilderness wanderings. This act was a physical and spiritual renewal of the Abrahamic covenant, which included circumcision as a sign of their unique relationship with God. None of them had been circumcised in that generation in the wilderness, so that's the first thing they did. It was also a symbol of dedication. Circumcision served as a recommitment to God and His laws, symbolizing the people's dedication and their obedience to God. It marked the transition from the old generation that had died in the wilderness due to disobedience to a new generation who were ready to follow God faithfully. The next thing that they did was celebrate the Passover. Read about that in Joshua chapter 5, verse 10. The Israelites celebrated the Passover at Gilgal, marking their first observance of this festival in the Promised Land. And so this celebration commemorated their deliverance from Egypt and the slavery that they bore in Egypt, and it also reinforced their identity as God's redeemed people. Observing Passover reminded the Israelites of God's faithfulness in fulfilling His promises as they now stood in the land that He had sworn to give them. They had celebrated the Passover when they escaped from Egypt out in the desert, but now they celebrated it in the land that they had hoped to see all of their lives. And so it strengthened their faith and trust in God's continued guidance and protection. Another interesting thing that took place was about the manna, the cessation of manna and eating the produce of the land, Joshua 5, 11, 12. So after celebrating the Passover, the Israelites ate the produce of the land, and the manna that had sustained them in the wilderness ceased. No more manna each morning. So this transition signified their entry into a new phase of God's provision, where they would rely on the bounty of the promised land and no longer rely on the manna from heaven. This change highlighted their dependence on God's provision, but it highlighted it in a brand new way, reinforcing their trust in Him as they settled the land. They would now trust that He would provide from the produce of the land rather than provide through the miraculous manna. Another preparation was a theophany of the commander of the Lord's army. Joshua encounters a mysterious figure identified as the commander of the Lord's army, who tells Joshua to remove his sandals because he is standing on holy ground. Doesn't that sound familiar? Wasn't that what in the burning bush the voice told Moses to do? This theophany, we call it a theophany, a divine appearance in some form or another. This theophany emphasizes the holiness of the mission they're about to undertake, and of course the need for reverence and submission to God. They weren't just going in to wage war, they were going in to fulfill a promise that God had made to the people. So this encounter with the angel reassures Joshua of God's direct involvement and support in the forthcoming battles. It also reinforces the idea that the conquest of Jericho and subsequent victories would be achieved through divine power rather than human effort. Now, the spiritual preparatory steps taken in Joshua chapter 5, which I've just described, underscore the importance of covenantal faithfulness, being faithful to the covenant that existed between God and the people of Israel. Also a remembrance of God's past deliverance, and also trust in His ongoing provision and reverence for His holy presence. These steps ensured that the Israelites were spiritually ready for the conquest of Jericho by renewing their covenant with God through circumcision, through commemorating their identity and their deliverance through the Passover, and also transitioning to a new form of divine sustenance, and of course acknowledging God's holy leadership and support through the theophany. You have to remember, they were not an organized, skilled, well-equipped army. They were going into a land where there were skilled armies, where there were fortresses, where there were towns that were heavily guarded by experienced soldiers. And so they had to develop a strong faith in God in order to deliver these people and these towns into their hand. And so together, all these actions that we've talked about aligned the Israelites with God's will, fortified their faith, and prepared them for the miraculous victories that lay ahead. You're always much more confident when you know in your mind and your heart and your conscience that you are following God's will, that you're working in His power. And so we move on to the conquest of Jericho and begin with the instructions that Joshua receives from God concerning this particular campaign. God gives Joshua specific instructions on how to conquer Jericho. The strategy involves a seemingly unconventional approach. In other words, something that had almost nothing to do with military strategy. The Israelites were to march around the city once every day for 6 days. That's the beginning of the strategy. Then 7 priests carrying trumpets made of ram's horns are to go before the Ark of the Covenant as they are making their way around the city. There we go. On the 7th day, they are to march around the city not once, but 7 times. 7 times around the city, and the priests are to blow trumpets. At the sound of a long blast on the trumpets, the people are to shout loudly, and then they are told the walls of the city will collapse. Well, the collapsing of the walls of the city means that they have, entrance into the city in order to attack. But what they did, or the instructions that God gave them, had nothing to do, there was no connection between what they were doing and the collapse of the wall. Perhaps breaching the walls with ladders or stones or other conventional military methods might have made some sense to them, but what God had asked them to do had nothing to do with military strategy. However, we see that Joshua leads the people in the execution of the plan. So Joshua relays God's instructions to the people. For 6 days, the Israelite warriors, priests with trumpets, and the Ark of the Covenant all march around Jericho once a day in silence, and then they return to the camp each night. The silent march creates a sense of anticipation, and it also demonstrated discipline and obedience to God's command. Then we have the final march and the victory, chapter 6, verses 15 to 21. On the 7th day, the Israelites rise early and they march around the city 7 times. And on the 7th circuit, the priests blow the trumpets and Joshua commands the people to shout. And so, just as God said, the walls collapse. As the people shout, the walls of Jericho collapse and the Israelites charge straight into the city, capturing it. Following God's command, the Israelites destroy everything in the city, men, women, children, livestock, except for, remember Rahab, right? Rahab and her family. She was the one who watched over the spies and hid them from the soldiers in Jericho. And because of her actions and of course the faith that motivated her actions, she was spared due to her protection of the spies at that time, she and her family. As far as the salvation of Rahab is concerned, Joshua, as we read in chapter 6, he sends 2 spies to bring Rahab and her family out safely, honoring the promise that was made to her. And the promise was, if you and your family stay in your dwelling, you will be safe. We find out that Rahab and her family are spared, and they're integrated into the Israelite community. And this highlights the idea or the reward for her faith and her assistance. Her life is not just saved, but she's also allowed to become part of the Israelite community. And we read later on that she even appears in the genealogy of Jesus. Then we have curses and dedication in Joshua chapter 6. Joshua pronounces a curse on anyone who would rebuild Jericho, declaring that the foundation and the gates would be laid, but at the cost of the rebuilder's firstborn and youngest son. Also, they have a dedication of the spoils, the city's spoils, including the silver and the gold, the articles of bronze and iron. All of this are dedicated to the Lord's treasury, signifying that the victory is for God's glory. So let's take a look at the spiritual significance of the way that Jericho was conquered. As I said, it wasn't conventional military practice that won the victory. The first thing that they needed to do that gave them victory was obedience to God's command. The unconventional strategy required complete obedience and trust in God's instructions. The Israelites' adherence to God's plan, despite its unusual nature, underscores the importance of following divine guidance without question. Also, obedience to God, even when it seems illogical by human standards, leads to miraculous outcomes and a demonstration of faith. There's also the divine power and the intervention that took place. The collapse of Jericho's walls through a miraculous act rather than conventional warfare highlights that the victory was achieved by God's power and not by human might, a lesson that the Israelites had to learn early on, because this was not going to be their last military operation. Success and victory in spiritual battles come through reliance on God's power and intervention rather than human strength and tactics. And that is true today as well as it was true during the time of Joshua's leadership. Also, the sanctity of God's presence. The Ark of the Covenant, which symbolized God's presence, played a central role in the march. It emphasized that the battle belonged to the Lord, and His presence was crucial for the victory. The lesson for us is that God's presence among His people is essential for overcoming obstacles and achieving His purposes. Faith and patience, of course, played a part. The Israelites' silent march for 7 days required patience and unwavering faith in God's promise. It would have been easy for someone to say, oh, this is silly, what, we have to march again? Some wise military analyst speaking up and thinking that what they were doing was nonsensical. But no, they didn't. There was no break in ranks. Everybody marched around, everybody was silent, everybody went back. And so the 7-day period and the final shout symbolized the completion of God's perfect plan. Again, the lesson for us, faith often involves waiting and persistent trust in God's timing and God's methods. And then finally, the issue of judgment and mercy. The total destruction of Jericho signifies God's judgment on the wickedness of the Canaanites. And as we continue this study and review some of their practices, you'll see what I mean by that. So God's judgment on the wickedness of the Canaanites, while the salvation of Rahab and her family demonstrates God's mercy and grace towards those who show faith. She, as we had mentioned before, was a prostitute, and yet because of her faith, God forgave her this sin, these sins, and included her among the saved. The lesson for us, of course, God's justice is paired with His mercy. He's not just a God of mercy. People say, well, God is love, and love of God would never do this or that. But we need to remember that God is a combination of many things, two of which are He is a God of judgment, perfect judgment and justice, but He's also a God of mercy, rewarding faith and righteousness, even in the midst of judgment. And so the destruction of Jericho, with its detailed divine instructions and miraculous execution, serves as a profound testament to the importance of obedience and faith and the acknowledgement of God's supreme power in the lives of His people. Again, and I can't repeat this enough, at the time of Joshua, as we see in this episode, as well as our own lives today. And I think if we took account and asked people to share different experiences that they've had in their lives, they could come up with similar stories of obeying God, doing it God's way, and finding a solution to their problems or their suffering. Well, we go from an initial victory to a defeat. Israel is defeated at Ai. It's the name of a city, Ai, in Joshua chapter 7, verses 1 to 26. So let's summarize that. After the successful conquest of Jericho, the Israelites face a surprising and devastating defeat at the small city of Ai. Jericho was a big city, it was a fortress, it had military. Ai was a much smaller city, not as well defended. Confident from their previous victory, Joshua sends a small force to capture the city of Ai. But the Israelites are routed by the defenders, leading to the death of about 36 of their men. This unexpected defeat causes great distress among the people and, of course, Joshua, their leader, who seeks God's guidance and understanding of the cause for their failure. Dear Joshua, just like many of us, goes to God with the question, why? What happened? What did we do wrong? And so God reveals that Israel's defeat is due to sin within the Israelite camp. Specifically, Achan's disobedience in taking some of the devoted items from Jericho, which were supposed to be destroyed or dedicated to the Lord. In other words, he took some spoils of the war, stole those, hid those away for himself, and that was not what God had told them to do. And so as a result, God's favor was withdrawn from the Israelites until the sin was addressed. And so Joshua is instructed to sanctify the people and to root out the sin so that Israel can be restored to God's favor, which it did in identifying, judging, and executing Achan and his family for this treachery. Now, a couple of reasons why Israel failed at Achan. First of which is there was sin in the camp. That's the number one reason. Achan took some of the devoted items, and we read that he took some clothing, silver, and a bar of gold from Jericho, directly disobeying God's command that all such items be destroyed or given to the Lord's treasury. This sin was hidden from Joshua and the rest of Israel, but it caused God to withdraw His support, leading to their defeat at Ai. Sometimes we have to ask ourselves, when things aren't going right, when we can't seem to get going, when we can't seem to succeed, we need to kind of look within to see if there's sin in the camp, in the family, in our own hearts, before moving forward. And so the lesson there for us is that sin and disobedience, even by one individual, can have serious consequences for the entire community, especially when it involves violating God's explicit commands. Secondly, there was overconfidence and lack of consultation with God. After the triumph at Jericho, the Israelites became overconfident. Joshua and the leaders did not seek God's guidance before attacking Ai. Now, if you read the material, a part of the assignment, you would have seen that when they began planning their campaign against Ai, there was no time for prayer. Nobody sought God's advice. They just went ahead. They were on a roll. They had one military victory. They figured they could just go ahead without seeking God's advice. And so this lack of dependence on God led to poor strategic decisions. Again, the lesson: overconfidence and failure to seek God's direction can lead to misguided decisions and defeat, even in situations that seem straightforward. In other words, we need to pray about everything. We need to pray about everything that we do, the decisions that we make, large and small. We need to bring them before the Lord. Another point about their loss, their failure to address the hidden sin itself. The hidden sin of Achan affected the entire nation. The defeat at Ai highlights the principle of collective responsibility, where the community as a whole suffers because of the actions of a single member. And so Israel's failure to address and uncover this sin before the battle led to their defeat. Again, there's a lesson there. Unaddressed sin within a community of even one or more members can undermine collective efforts and lead to failure, emphasizing the importance of holiness and transparency required of everyone in the body, not just the leaders. In summary, Israel's defeat at Ai was due to disobedience, overconfidence, and lack of reliance on God, and of course the failure to address the hidden sin. This event underscores the critical importance of obedience and humility and accountability in maintaining God's favor and achieving progress in personal as well as corporate spiritual growth. See, it's important that we as individual members of the church regularly examine ourselves to see if we are in the faith, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 5. I'm reading these and sharing these observations from the Old Testament, and I'm trying to emphasize the idea that the lessons learned from these actions, the success they had and the failure that they had, fit exactly into our lives today. Many times we fail for the very same reasons that the Israelites failed, and many times we succeed for the very reasons that they succeeded. And so we move on. The story of the city of Ai is not over. They do go back and have a victory, and that's in chapter 8, verses 1 to 29. So after their initial defeat at Ai, due to Achan's sin, the Israelites regroup under Joshua's leadership. Now they have God's guidance. Following God's instructions, Joshua devises a new battle plan that leads to a decisive victory over the city of Ai. So the original plan that failed because of lack of divine guidance. There we go, lack of divine guidance. The initial plan involved sending a small contingent of troops to take the city, based on the assumption that the city was weak and it would be easy to conquer. This plan was made without seeking God's counsel, reflecting overconfidence and a reliance on human assessment rather than divine guidance. We don't see things the same way that God sees things. That's why we need to seek Him out, seek out His plan. And of course, the main mistake, the main strategic mistake that they made was that they had insufficient forces. Joshua initially sent only about 3,000 men, underestimating the strength of Ai's defenders. The Israelites were overpowered and they were forced to retreat. And as I said, resulting in the death of about 36 soldiers, but more importantly, demoralizing the entire nation. So there's a new battle plan given by God in Joshua chapter 8, verses 1 to 29. This time it's a divine strategy. God provides Joshua with a detailed battle plan. The strategy involves setting an ambush behind the city itself. And so Joshua is to lead a main force against Ai, drawing the city's defenders out. Meanwhile, a second contingent is hiding behind the city. The plan is, as Joshua and the main force approach the city, they feign a retreat, as they had done during the first failed attempt. And so the defenders, the military in the city, leave the city thinking the Israelites are again fleeing, and they begin pursuing them, but they leave the city unprotected. And so with the city's defenses emptied, the ambush forces its entry into Ai. It sets the city on fire, and then the main force turns around and begins to defeat the now surrounded defenders. So the defenders are lured out of the city and all of a sudden are caught in a pincer movement from the Israelites from behind the city and the Israelites that turned around and attacked them in front of the city. So they kind of boxed them in. So as Joshua and the main force approach Ai, they feign a retreat as they had done during the first failed attempt. The defenders of Ai, thinking the Israelites are again fleeing, pursue them, leave the city unprotected. When the city's defenses are emptied, the ambush forces the city to be defeated, as well as the defenders are defeated. So they have a successful battle plan which is completed. There's reasons why God's plan was superior. First of all, it was divine guidance they were receiving and divine assurances. Unlike the first attempt, the new plan was directly given by God, who assured Joshua of victory. The plan was executed with the knowledge that God was with them, restoring confidence and morale among the Israelites. Secondly, there was a comprehensive and strategic approach. God's plan involved a complex military strategy, including the use of an ambush, which demonstrated superior tactical thinking compared to the simplistic frontal assault that they did the first time. The ambush ensured that Ai's forces were drawn out of the city and they were isolated, making them vulnerable. And then of course, they obeyed completely and they executed according to the plan. The Israelites followed God's plan precisely, without deviation. Their obedience led to a flawless execution of the strategy, and it ensured a total victory. In summary, Israel's victory over Ai demonstrates the stark difference between human-centered planning and divinely guided strategy. The new plan given by God was superior because it was comprehensive and strategic and executed under His divine authority. It led to a successful conquest and the complete destruction of the city. This victory reinforced the importance of seeking God's guidance and obeying His commands at every endeavor. Well, we move from the explanation of military conquest to a formal religious practice where there is an altar that is built on Mount Ebal in Joshua chapter 8, verse 30 to 35. After the Israelites' victory over Ai, Joshua leads the people in a significant religious ceremony on Mount Ebal, which involved the construction of an altar to the Lord and the renewal of the covenant. This always comes back as we go through the book of Joshua and Judges. There's always this renewal of the covenant. The basic covenant is God says, I will bless you, I will protect you, I will prosper you, that's what I'll do, and you will obey me, you will be faithful, you will follow the instructions that I give you. Those are the terms of the covenant. And as Israel was wont to do it their way or to become unfaithful or to fall into evil practices, there was always the need for the renewal of this covenant. But the covenant was always the same. It was always the same covenant being renewed. God will bless you if you obey and if you continue to have faith. So this event held profound spiritual and theological significance. There was, of course, a covenant renewal and obedience of God's law. In other words, Joshua's actions on Mount Ebal fulfill the command given by Moses way back in Deuteronomy chapter 27. Moses had instructed the Israelites that when they entered the promised land, they were to build an altar on Mount Ebal. They were to write the law on stones, and they were to renew their covenant with God at that time. Joshua's adherence to this command demonstrates the importance of obedience to God's law. The altar and the subsequent reading of the law represented a formal renewal of the covenant between God and Israel. They were saying all over again, yes, we will obey, we will remain faithful. You are God. We anticipate that you will bless us and that you will protect us. This was the renewal. And by doing this, Joshua reaffirms Israel's commitment to the covenant, reminding the people of their obligation under God's law and His promises to them. Also, there is the symbolism of Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. These two mountains hold symbolic significance in the covenant ceremony. Mount Ebal, where the altar is built, represents the curses associated with disobedience to the covenant, while Mount Gerizim, where the blessings were pronounced, symbolized the blessings for obedience. And so by constructing the altar on Mount Ebal, Joshua acknowledges the seriousness of the covenant and the consequences for failing to uphold it. The public reading of both the blessings and the curses from the law emphasizes that the covenant relationship with God involves both rewards for obedience and consequences for disobedience. It serves as a comprehensive reminder of the full scope of the law and the seriousness with which it should be regarded. It was the law of God, not just a suggestion from God. It was the law of God. It was the law of God. It was a sure thing. When He said, if you obey me, I will bless you. That was a sure thing, because when they obeyed, they were blessed, they were prospered, they had peace, they had protection. And when they disobeyed, they had other armies that would overrun them. They had diseases, they had all kinds of problems. And so the promises of the covenant were sure. Another factor, the public worship and national unity. In other words, the ceremony on Mount Ebal was a public act of worship that involved the entire nation, men, women, children, and even the foreigners that were living among them. This inclusivity reinforced the idea that the covenant with God encompassed the entire community, uniting them under the shared law and the worship of Yahweh. By gathering the entire nation for this ceremony, Joshua strengthened the Israelites' sense of national identity as God's chosen people. This act of worship on Mount Ebal served to solidify their unity and collective commitment to living according to God's commands as they continued to conquer and settle the promised land. Remember, they're going into a land they don't know. They're not familiar with the place. They don't know the people. The people have strange customs. They're going in as a military activity to subdue the land, to empty the land of the people and settle the land. And so they needed a unity to do that, a unity of purpose, unity of understanding. And so this idea of this public worship that was performed on Mount Ebal was the vehicle, if you wish, that brought everyone together, men, women, children, foreigners, rich people, poor people, educated people, everyone together were together to worship God based on the covenant. And of course, there was the element of thanksgiving and sacrifice. The altar built on Mount Ebal is used to offer burnt offerings and peace offerings to God. Remember now, burnt offerings symbolized atonement and complete dedication to God. That's what a burnt offering was, while a peace offering signified thanksgiving and fellowship with God. So these type of sacrifices expressed the Israelites' gratitude for their recent victories and their reliance on God for continued success and protection. Also, by offering sacrifices on the altar immediately after the victory over Ai, Joshua and the Israelites acknowledged that their success was due to God's power and favor. It surely is an act of thanksgiving, but it's also an act of recognition that God is the source of their strength and their victory. And so in conclusion, the building of the altar on Mount Ebal after the victory over Ai is a significant act that underscores several key themes. For example, covenant renewal and obedience to God's law, the duality of blessings and curses in the covenant, the importance of public worship and national unity, and of course the acknowledgement of God's role in Israel's victories. And so this event served as a spiritual and national milestone, reinforcing the Israelites' identity as God's special people and their commitment to live according to His command and to live in the promised land. I mean, what were those victories all about? They were taking over the land, city by city, space by space. So there's a lesson here, one, I think, particular lesson here that we can draw. In Joshua chapters 5-8, a central overarching lesson revolves around obedience to God's commands and the consequences of disobedience. We learn from these writings that success and blessings come through obedience to God, while disobedience leads to failure and suffering. Sooner or later, there's no escaping it. A judgment's coming for sin sooner or later. And in the story here of their failure at the city of Ai, we see an immediate judgment coming after the sin of disobedience and the fact that there was sin in the camp. The thing that we have to kind of grasp is that judgment always follows sin, sooner or later. That's the key there in brackets. Sooner or later, there'll be a judgment. And so the narrative encourages maintaining a close, obedient relationship with God, understanding that even small acts of disobedience can have significant consequences, but also that repentance and renewed faithfulness can restore God's favor and our peace of mind and spiritual strength. All right, so that's the lesson from chapters 5-8. I want to assign the assignment or the homework, if you wish. I want you to reread chapters 5-8. Now that it's been explained, you've read it once, I explained it in class, you read it again, and this time with your reading, I think you'll have a greater understanding. And in preparation for our next class, I want you to go ahead and read chapters 9-12 in Joshua. Again, you read at home, I explain in class. All right, that's it for this time. We'll see you at our next meeting. I hope that this class has been a blessing to you. I pray that God blesses you, and we'll see you next time.